Storytelling is the term I use to describe everything from video games, books, comics, and even music. It's a very broad topic, but one which has a few commonalities across all the mediums. Sometimes what is good in one medium can be completely terrible in another. Regardless of the mediums we find ourselves experiencing a story through, however, I have some personal pet peeves which rustle my jimmies anytime I see them. My goal with this video is not necessarily to tell other people how a story should be told, but more so describe my own personal gripes and annoyances and perhaps provide an alternative which I think is better. So sit down, grab a drink, a blanket, hit the subscribe button, and if you're so inclined, become a member to my channel to view videos early, as well as some other perks listed on screen right now. These are my storytelling pet peeves in no particular order. The first thing on my list, and something I think should often be left in a rough draft of a story, is the "allow me to explain what you just saw" trope, which I don't really have a better name for this, and in this video you will likely see that I do not have a lot of good names for any of these things, but I think you guys understand what I mean. Now, this pet peeve in particular does not say anything about exposition. In fact, in some of my other videos, I advise you as writers to utilize telling the audience as just another tool to save time and pick your battles as a writer. However, if I were to add something to that advice, I would say that you should not tell and show for the same thing. This is where my pet peeve comes from. It's the moment in a story where you have been shown or told something already, and the writer, for some ungodly reason, doesn't think you understand what you've just seen or heard, so they do both to make you really understand. I find it to be fairly condescending as a viewer, and oftentimes it comes off as the writer being insecure about how much their audience can understand their thoughts and their world. One example of this is in the old Pokemon anime, which did this quite often. A Pokemon would launch something like a flamethrower attack at another Pokemon. The other Pokemon would get burned and wince in pain to show that it had been burned. And then the show would cut over to Brock and Misty, and Misty would ask Brock, "What was that?" And Brock would proudly declare to the audience, "That was Flamethrower. It's a powerful fire-type move that can burn Pokemon sometimes." Like, yeah, Brock, we fucking know. We just fucking saw that. Commentary like this is often completely useless, and the only utility it seems to serve is padding out runtimes. It's kind of like when I loop back and make the exact same point twice in a row for a video. I mean, a completely understandable mistake that anyone could make, and it's not actually that bad, guys. I mean, come on. I also acknowledge that sometimes it is necessary to both show and tell when the thing which is being shown is supremely complicated, or when the audience could not be expected to fully understand what is happening based on their current level of knowledge. Jujutsu Kaisen and their power system comes to mind immediately. Sometimes shit happens and the narrator really does need to pull us aside and say, "Here's what you just saw." But in that same show, I also think Gege, the writer, ends up fucking his own story with that very same style of writing. If you, as the writer, are always questioning whether or not people will understand your complex magic system, then maybe it's time to simplify the magic system and make it more consumable for people. Instead of just padding shit out for the sake of runtime or over-explaining everything like it's a video essay trying to get more views from a longer video runtime on YouTube, and yes, I did repeat the same joke and I'm still doing the joke, I'm explaining myself to show you how annoying it is. Glad you understand now, because you definitely wouldn't had I not repeatedly said the same thing in a different way. Anyways, where was I? What was I saying? Whatever. Moving on, another pet peeve I have in storytelling is what I would like to call fantastic concept, terrible execution. Literature RPGs, or lit RPGs, are a genre of fiction which suffer from this concept greatly. And if you don't know what a literature RPG is, it's basically when a power system of a story is built upon role-playing game mechanics. Think shows like Danmachi, Solo Leveling, or even something like the Pokemon Adventure manga. Oftentimes in this genre, we will have a really well thought out and interesting game mechanic system for leveling up the stats of our main character, character, only for the story to pretty much shit the bed by ensuring that our main character is pretty much the only person in their story who ends up mattering. The only lit RPG I can think of off the top of my head which has not shit the bed in this way is the aforementioned Pokemon Adventures manga, which I highly suggest anyone read if they want to learn how to actually write game mechanics into a narrative which makes sense while simultaneously developing and building great characters with an intriguing story for children and adults alike. Digressions aside, the reason this is a pet peeve of mine is usually because I cannot help but think about how good the story I'm consuming could be, when it is instead held back by the writer's incessant need to fulfill a power fantasy for themselves and for the readers. Utilizing game mechanics or cool concepts just to tell the most boring, bog-standard story imaginable, where all the villains are basically the same person who will start shit with our godlike main protagonist, only to get folded like origami less than a second after talking their shit. But this pet peeve of mine applies to more than just literature RPGs. Darling in the Franxx is another great example of a story which had a fantastic concept but an absolutely terrible execution. Or rather, it had a really good execution up until about 16 episodes in before absolutely shitting the bed. What sucks most about this pet peeve is the feeling of wasted potential, and the inability to see what could have been. Still, I don't find this nearly as annoying as my next pet peeve. Mouthpiece characters. Ironically enough, the only characters who should keep their mouths shut happen to be the same characters who most constantly ruin any sort of good storytelling so that the author can vent to their audience about something through a character that they've made. Mouthpiece characters are often suffering from a litany of other bad writing tropes, but oftentimes they fall into similar pitfalls. It's basically a character who espouses the writer's belief and whom no one aside from a straw man ever seems to oppose. The Mouthpiece character, much like the Mary Sue, will force the story and world to come to a grinding halt around them so that the writer can create an allegory for whatever rant they want to make at the time. It sucks to read, and especially when it happens in the middle of a story that I'm already enjoying. Like, honestly, just do what I do and make a video essay on YouTube. Jeez. Somewhat related to this pet peeve is my pet peeve for whenever the author addresses the audience with a thinly veiled allegory or caricature of their critics. When I think of this pet peeve, I think of a series of episodes from Teen Titans Go, where Freak Show tells the Titans about how shitty their current show is and how cool the original show used to be. The writers of the show unapologetically put themselves in a position of victimhood and their audience members in a position of being unsavory people. And even when I don't personally feel called out by the straw man they prop up, it's still not a good story to tell. Like, who cares what people are saying about your show? Just make the show and ignore the audience who are hate watchers. If it's not clear by now, I tend to hate any storytelling things which bring the narrative to a grinding halt just so the author can pull the audience aside and explain things to us like we're children. This brings me to my next pet peeve, which I call, "No, I don't fucking care about how this thing works. Please just continue the story." A good example of this is any story for which part of the appeal is the mystery surrounding their power systems, world, or lore, only for the writer to decide we must know the truth of those things and derail any sort of competent storytelling to give us a quick lecture on how everything works. It's the same exact vibe as someone watching a movie with us and them chiming in like,
Actually, did you know that in real life, if someone were to scream in space, you wouldn't hear anything because there's no air in space, and the sound is caused by air vibrating our eardrums?
Like, cool, dude. Neat fact. This does not help me enjoy the story more, and now I've missed what the characters were saying so you could tell me how space works. My next pet peeve has to do with power levels. Oh boy, power levels. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with power levels. Akira Toriyama, God rest his soul, introduced the concept of power levels as a joke, and everyone took it seriously. Don't get me wrong, sometimes I think having a numerical measure of power is actually a cool way to gauge how strong a character is in comparison to other characters. However, the irony of power levels in Dragon Ball is that it was initially a writing device for Toriyama to show how meaningless they were in the first place, and how power levels can be changed mid-fight depending on the techniques that are being used. I hate power levels in stories for several reasons. One reason is because the community which talks about power scaling and power levels is completely insufferable and often ignores the merits of good storytelling to cherry pick examples and do some sort of pseudo-math to determine and scale fictional characters. The other reason I dislike power levels is what it often does to a story. If a writer introduces a reliable power level system, then we should know that someone with a higher power level will almost always beat someone with a lower power level. But that also removes any sort of narrative tension from the story. So instead, most power level systems end up destroying themselves in favor of telling a good story, only to piss off the power scaling community when someone like Goku gets injured by a bullet after not training for a few months, who then proceeds to take a planet-cracking punch to the jaw a few episodes later after having done at least 1,000 push-ups. Power levels often don't have caps either, and if they ever do introduce power ceilings to the story, it can be very tempting for the writer to just find a way to break that ceiling anyway, and have the debris crash back down on the rest of the story in the process. You know what's way better? Just don't introduce power levels in your story. Another pet peeve in storytelling that I have is when I see a story reference itself. And while I can handle this trope in moderation, it quickly becomes annoying when the story seems to have lost the plot in favor of retreading old jokes or situations we've already seen. The Simpsons is an excellent example of this. There are countless moments in the modern Simpsons shows which rely solely on random bullshit humor for shock laughs, or which reference the memes and inside jokes of their own series, only for those references to make absolutely no fucking sense in the context of the character referencing them. Homer sending a gif of himself retreating into the bushes to Lisa as a way to avoid coming to her concert comes to mind. A lot of the times, to me, this comes off as the writer saying, "Remember when we were actually good guys?" And yeah, it sucks to be reminded about how good something used to be, all the while seeing how a story cannot seem to ever escape its own fucking shadow. Speaking of never escaping someone else's shadow, I gotta say that I am also not a huge fan of characters whose sole purpose in the narrative is to dick ride other characters. Whether it's a villain of the show or one of the main character's friends, I don't think anyone loves seeing a professional glazer at work. Usually this type of character is a crutch that the author leans on so that they can build up another character and tell the audience about how cool that other character is. Because for some reason, the author can't just show us how cool the other character is. These meat writer characters also tend to be just rather pathetic and annoying characters too. The most glaring example that comes right off the top of my head is Yu Jin-ho, and if you have watched or read Solo Leveling but do not remember who Yu Jin-ho is, he's the pathetic trust fund baby who cannot stop throating Sung Jin-woo's cock for more than 5 seconds anytime he's on screen. A character like Jin-ho is someone who serves no purpose to the story. They often tag along to the main character to show how much more powerful and cool the main character is by comparison to the pathetic dick sucker following them around. It's kinda like mogging, or whatever the kids call it these days. And funnily enough, Solo Leveling ends up turning pretty much every single character in the series into a professional glazer or a professional hater eventually. So it's kinda just another reason why that story in particular fucking sucks in my eyes. But that's another video entirely. Speaking of turning decent characters into insufferable pieces of shit, let's talk about character assassination next. Character assassination, or character derailment, is when you've got a perfectly good and likable character, only to then switch their personality with the intention of making the audience despise them. Character assassination often happens when the writers of the show or story switch hands, and either through ignorance or malicious intent, a certain character is mishandled in the story. Oftentimes, this character does things which are far outside of their pre-established personalities and makes no sense aside from contriving some sort of conflict in the plot. When character derailment happens, it is often because the writer desires to use that character as a sacrificial lamb to slaughter in the hopes of creating what they would view as a more interesting story. This is often not a matter of organic growth or development on the character's part, but rather a complete and utter misunderstanding and mishandling of the character itself. Either the writer actually dislikes this character, or they have enough hubris to think that they can write it better. Some examples of this include certain iterations of Spider-Man, the entirety of Zack Snyder's DC Cinematic Universe, Luke from the sequel trilogy of Star Wars, and Master Chief from the live-action Halo TV show. And speaking of characters getting absolutely fucking murdered on screen, let's talk about one of my least favorite things to see in any battle shonen. You know him, you love him, it's Potential Man, the character of the show who is really strong, guys, we swear. Sure, I mean, this character always gets fucking bodied by everyone they ever fight, and only ever seems to get a W over faceless mooks to remind us how strong they are, but it's not important right now. We need this character to be our sacrificial lamb to establish how great other characters are by beating the fuck out of this character nonstop. When I think of this pet peeve, my mind immediately jumps to Jogo from JJK. I think it's pretty self-explanatory if you've ever watched the show. The only fights we ever see Jogo in are fights with two of the canonically most powerful characters in history. Time and time again, the narrator of JJK must assure us that Jogo is actually strong. Heck, even Sukuna, right after slapping the shit out of Jogo for 30 minutes straight and not getting hit once, tells Jogo and the audience by proxy that he was, in fact, strong and should be proud of himself. And the only W Jogo ever gets is killing one random old man who was never introduced before this, burning Nanami and making Maki go through her Toji arc. So, in essence, Jogo only killed one beeline character throughout the entire series and lost every single other fight he's ever been a part of. The thing I hate most about these types of characters is how the author almost seems allergic to giving them a W. Their only purpose in whatever story they find themselves in seems to be as a gatekeeper for who is strong in the series and who isn't. It's especially frustrating when I actually like their character, but they're just held back by the author's need to use them and glaze the fuck out of a different character that I don't like. The Pokemon games are notorious for this. We need look no further than the rivals Pokemon puts in front of the protagonist of every mainline game. They've almost never got strong Pokemon teams. The game resets and allows you to re-challenge them if you lose, and right down to their personalities, they're just complete pushovers. I long for the good old days when Pokemon was not afraid to write asshole rivals for us to beat, and I long for the rival character who is capable of holding their own and getting W's outside of having their entire personality revolve around the main character. The rival of the Gen 1 games was compelling, not because they were an asshole to be beaten at every turn, but because they were an asshole who managed to become a champion of the Pokemon League before us, and were our first and final obstacle for achieving our goals. It was poetic in a way, and I miss that shit, genuinely. And if we're talking about an easy way to fix a character like this, I would tell every writer to do one thing. Recognize this character does not show true strength whenever they fight, and give them a fucking power-up until they start to actually get a ton of W's and threaten the main characters. Or, better yet, if they are strong and they have to lose a fight, make sure the fight is at least close to where we can still respect the fucking loser. And this brings me to my next pet peeve, which is the overpowered main protagonist with a personality more boring than a wet napkin. Oh my fucking god, do I hate characters like this. Pick any isekai you see airing, and you will find this character at the helm of the ship 9 times out of 10. Oftentimes, these characters are gifted incredibly powerful abilities by some sort of god or divinity, only to be the most boring little goody two-shoes with those abilities. I'm thinking of protagonists who cannot hold hands with a female character until they've gotten married. That type of shit. The type of protagonist that will proudly proclaim that they are against slavery, as if that's some sort of high bar or praiseworthy achievement to be against slavery. Belle from Danmachi suffers greatly from this type of bad writing. We begin the story of Danmachi characterizing Belle Cranel as a coward too weak to defeat most monsters or even talk to women, only to later on gain an ability which allows him to level up way faster than anyone else ever has in history, so long as he is emotional enough. And if that wasn't bad enough, Belle Cranel also seems to be the only person in the entire world with a semi-functioning brain and basic level of human decency, oftentimes having to save poor defenseless women from getting harassed by proudly shouting, "It's wrong to harass women!" The worst part about this type of character is how completely fucking non-controversial they are. Their opinions and virtues are almost always going to boil down to common human decency within a world where everyone seems to be a dumb idiot that has never thought about their actions having consequences, simplifying complex issues and problems into bog standard misinterpretations of true morality. What? There's a slave trade? Hey guys, owning other people is wrong.
What? I never thought about it like that. You know what? You're right. I'm freeing all of my slaves.
Hey, protagonist, I actually kind of like being a slave. Do you mind if I consent to being your slave? What? Well, if you want to be my slave, I guess you can. Consent is important after all.
That type of shit just makes me fucking vomit anytime I see it happen in a story. This overpowered protagonist is truly never challenged on their views, and they rarely ever really build relationships with other characters. Relationships just tend to happen for these characters. Speaking of relationships which just tend to happen, let's talk about romance for a bit. What do we think romance needs? Chemistry? Shared interests? An effort from both parties to make the relationship work? Well, for my next pet peeve, we actually need none of these things. Have you ever watched a show or read a story where you think to yourself, why are these two characters together? Well, I have, plenty of fucking times. Whether it's from a normal show where the romance is not a focus to, God fucking forbid, an actual romance story where the sole focus is the romance, I absolutely cannot stand when two characters lack any sort of good reasons or chemistry to be romantically involved with one another. In fact, when this happens, it's often because the author has a male main protagonist and they've introduced a random female protagonist to their story. Now, what is the function of this random female protagonist, you might be asking? It's basically just to check a box for the male protagonist to have a love interest and a happy ending. These characters are not actually characters because they often function solely as robots for the protagonist to marry and love by the end of the story. I can often spot this in a story when I look at two characters in a relationship and I go, hey, wait a minute, what do these two actually like about one another? Only to have surface level answers such as, this character likes the way the other character smells, or this character was saved by the other character once, and now they have never gotten over it. When there are so many good ways to make romance interesting in a story, these relationships defiantly say no, and instead expect us to all agree that the characters they've chosen to be together make sense. This romance is often accompanied by the author telling us something to the effect of, it was love at first sight, or it's love which cannot be explained, which is just a way of saying, yeah, they love each other for no reason. I realize I've been rather vague for the past few paragraphs of this script, so I'll give a few examples of this happening in fiction. Romeo and Juliet, any pairing in Nisekoi, any pairing from Infinite Stratos, any pairing from Rent a Girlfriend, any pairing from insert rom-com anime here, Sung Jin Woo and Chai Hae In, Goku and Chi-Chi, and any female pairing to the main character of an Adam Sandler movie. Also Terry McGinnis and his girlfriend from Batman Beyond, because literally every single other romance option is better. In pretty much all of these romances, there is a distinct lack of any actual romance. Sure, some of them may provide the innocuous, I like him because he's kind argument, but that's hardly romantic chemistry, especially when being kind is something almost anyone can be, and it is very rarely ever fully recognized or rewarded in real life, at least in that way. I would rather my romances be filled with a mix of shallow and deep reasons for these characters being together. I would like to see the cute interactions between characters that show how much they actually like each other's company, and how much these characters care about one another. Some human fucking connection is what I want to see. I hate the concept that two characters must be together because one is a guy and the other is a girl, all the while not providing the audience with anything to point to or justify the relationship in the first place. Just that the relationship happens because it's heterosexual, as if it's just meant to be. Relationships take effort, and unconditional love is boring as fuck. Speaking of which, a pet peeve related to this is whenever I see an interesting female character on the screen, only for them to become the most boring trad wife imaginable after getting married or becoming the main character's girlfriend. This also applies to stories where the first kiss is basically the end of the story, or getting together is the ultimate goal. Oftentimes, romance writers, especially in Japan, don't seem to know what to fucking do with themselves after their two main love interests have finally tied the knot. They were too busy dangling the concept of a relationship over everyone's face and writing about the chase to recognize that relationships, and the conflicts therein, do not stop when the bouquet is tossed. I could also call this trope Taming the Tomboy, and relate it closely to character assassination. In fact, I think this is one of the more common ways female characters' personalities are assassinated in favor of someone more tame and boring. Darling in the Franxx immediately comes to mind in this regard. 02 is probably one of the most interesting female characters in fiction. There's a mystique to her actions, and their rebellious, untamed spirit exudes an unspoken riz upon everyone who watches her. At least until she gets together with Hiro and turns into the most boring trad wife possible. The moment, and I mean the literal moment, 02 gets in a relationship with Hiro, all of her underlying flaws and interesting character traits, and as well as engaging dialogue, goes completely out of the window in favor of our boring main protagonist and whatever the fuck he thinks about anything that's going on. All the while having 02 sit in silence and behave like a good girlfriend. To me, it often sends the message that the author thinks everything is resolved once characters get together, and no one cares to actually contribute or put effort into a relationship when they know they no longer need to chase their lover around. It's a rather bleak and frankly disgusting outlook on human relationships that I'm afraid far too many people unironically believe in. But sometimes I also think that this can fall in the opposite direction. Which brings me to my next pet peeve. When two characters in a romance are having a stupid fight for no apparent reason other than to contrive conflict for a story. Oftentimes this will happen between someone like Mary Jane and Peter Parker in Spider-Man comics, where the two will have some sort of strange falling out with one another that makes no sense for either of their characters. But I think a much more popular example of this pet peeve would be from Invincible, between Mark and Amber. During the first season of Invincible, when we see Mark getting chewed out by Amber for keeping his superhero identity a secret, I think everyone on the internet had a collective aneurysm over it, and for good reason. To feel offended that someone is keeping a secret from you is one thing, but refusing to understand that Mark did not want to endanger his family or you by revealing his identity is a completely different story. The conflict seemingly only exists to contrive a reason for Mark and Amber to be fighting as some sort of melodrama in their relationship. It also just ends up making us despise Amber as a character for being so completely batshit insane about it instead of just being reasonable and understanding instead. It's meaningless conflict which comes off like the writer saying, "See,
This is what real relationships look like. People fighting over stupid shit."
And that's just so unbelievably cynical and oversimplified that it tends to boil my blood whenever I see it. But if that boils my blood, then I would say that this next trope, really? But if that boils my blood, then I would say that this next trope absolutely vaporizes my blood into a fine mist. Because Holy fuck, do I hate when characters start playing idiot ball. Idiot ball, for those who don't know, is when seemingly competent characters or pre-established competent characters suddenly, inexplicably become incompetent, and that incompetency fuels the plot for the rest of the story. This goes hand in hand with character derailment and assassination, but with one distinct difference. I am constantly made to wonder why these fucking idiots are doing anything in the story when they could just stop being idiots for 2 fucking seconds and fix everything. And this is not a criticism of idiot plots either. I actually really love stories like Konosuba, for example. Nor is this a critique of plots which rely on a character's stupidity to happen. No, this is specifically when a previously competent and intelligent or clever character causes tons of problems for no reason and retracts any character growth they might have had in favor of being a dumbass. Fairly Odd Parents was a show that often did this in the later seasons. Long after Timmy Turner learned the values of being selfless and caring about other people, it always seems like he tends to forget those lessons just so that the plot can happen. Instead of being a story about growing up and maturing under the love and care of adoptive parental figures, Fairly Odd Parents turned Timmy Turner from a dumb kid who needed to learn a few lessons to a maliciously selfish idiot who refuses to change or grow at all. This also happens during a few episodes in Adventure Time, namely the saga of episodes where Marceline has to slay a bunch of vampires from her past. Finn and Jake, often the heroes of the story and of the realm, are instead complete bumbling fucking idiots which Marceline cannot rely on during numerous points in these episodes. Finn and Jake will often fumble garlic bombs and hit themselves with it, letting vampires get away, or misunderstanding a situation and making it worse, or just becoming useless captives who make Marceline's job way harder than it needs to be. It just never made sense to me, and I always kinda hated those episodes for the way they treated Finn and Jake. Another example of this is Luke Skywalker, wherein the entirety of the sequel trilogy's plot is pretty much due to his own incompetence and jaded attitude. For some reason, he allowed all of the new Jedi to be slaughtered by one person, and instead of bringing Ben Solo to justice, he runs away to live as a hermit for years where no one can find him, only to not really teach Rey anything about the Force while Rey kinda just bodies him during every interaction they have. Then he has one moment of competence only to reveal that he force ghosted himself into becoming an actual ghost. Instead of, I don't know, staying alive and helping in any other meaningful fucking way? The more I write about this topic, the more I realize that I can pretty much complain forever about things which annoy me in fiction. It's an unholy hydra of petty hatred. I list off one pet peeve, and then 2 more appear. In other words, stay tuned for another video on this topic because this one is already too long. Hit the subscribe button if you want to be notified when I post that. And if you have a little bit of extra money lying around, please do feel free to support me with the join button below. Thanks so much for watching, and thanks for listening to me yap for the last probably 30-40 minutes. See ya!